Thank you, Felipe. Now, the next speaker is Mr. Joaquin Cottani from Standard & Poor's Global Ratings.
Thank you. If you don't mind, since I don't have a presentation, I'll do it from here. Is that okay? So, well, first of all, thank you. Great conference, great city. And I'm going to touch on things that Felipe and others have said. The reason I don't have a presentation, by the way, is I'm going to talk about the piece of research that is not published yet, and because of regulations, not because there is any sensitive information in that, across the board regulations, so I can't do it. But the issue is exposure to trade. As Felipe was saying, exposure to China is not a good definition. Exposure to trade, because trade is correlated with trade in China, with trade in the United States, with trade in the world. It's not the same as vulnerability. So typically, when we look at exposure to trade, we have to look at the exports of a country relative to GDP, and then weigh that by the elasticity of the exports of one country with respect to world demand. And not every country, and that in turn depends, the latter, on the type of goods that the country exports. And those goods, the IMF has recently shown how elasticity of exports of manufactured goods is so much lower than that for commodities. So, and there are also, in an elasticity of the trade of one country vis-a-vis the trade in the world, some other domestic considerations, such as supply-side constraints, which are not necessarily symmetrical. For example, if you compare in the region Chile and Brazil, you will find that the elasticity of the exports of Brazil to world trade is much higher than that of Chile, twice as high. And that probably has to do with how quickly you can respond when you have exports that part of them may be hard commodities such as mining, but you have also manufactured commodities, and you have food that can be produced more elastically. So, but that's export. That's exposure. Exposure depends on how open your economy is, and also how elastic the response of your exports are to world trade. Now, vulnerability depends on that, but it also depends on policies and institutions. Roughly speaking, vulnerability is the product of exposure plus times a multiplier. And that multiplier is determined in turn by different factors. There is exchange rate flexibility, and there is whether the capital account is exogenous or endogenous. There is also whether real exchange depreciation is in the short run expansionary or contractionary, because we have countries like Argentina and Brazil where a real devaluation can be very contractionary in the short run. Expansionary effects are felt in the long run, and that's of course because in the short run the income effect outweighs the substitution effect, and that has to do with the fact that tradables in those countries include products that have a great weight on the consumer basket. Venezuela would be a country like sells oil and imports everything else. Obviously, in normal times, is a country in which devaluation is extremely contractionary. But that is not a reason not to have a flexible exchange rate, of course, but it's something that will affect the vulnerability in the short run. Capital account, exogenous or endogenous, by that what I mean is that some countries are more financially constrained than others, and that explains why advanced SOEs may be very exposed or as exposed as emerging markets, but they are always going to be more vulnerable to them. Why? Because if you have a shock in the form of a drop in exports, in one case you could buffer it through your access to capital markets. In the other case, and especially if, as a result of the shock on exports, international investors decide to lend more, lend less, then you are, the way to adjust is to cut imports as the balance of payment restriction dictates, and that means that the only way to cut imports is by reducing income, and therefore the reduction in income is higher than otherwise. So all things that are obviously known and textbook economics would not only tell you the direction of results, it will tell you exactly what these things more or less depend on. And the numbers I have and that I promise to distribute among the participants show very clearly that those a prioris of theory are perfectly supported by the data. The data used is for 20 countries, including 13 emerging markets. The other 7 are advanced small open economies, and the period that I use is with quarterly data from 2001 to 2015. And the most vulnerable, the most exposed countries in Latin America are Venezuela, Chile, Peru, Colombia. The least exposed are Argentina and Brazil, yet the most vulnerable are Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina, and the less vulnerable are Chile, Peru, Colombia. Mexico is a case in which, typically when one looks at Mexico and brings China into the question, the immediate reaction is, well, Mexico doesn't trade with China, so it's completely not exposed, not vulnerable. But it is because, again, Mexico depends on world trade, and world trade is correlated with trade in China. Whether its exposure is to the United States or not doesn't mean that indirectly, as the U.S. economy will also be affected by events in the world, Mexico is exposed to, but it has a vulnerability that's still among the lowest in the region. And that's it.